There's a very interesting statement of the sages that is relevant to the story we've been talking about. The Gemara says that the conversation of the servant of our forefathers is more beautiful than the instruction in the Torah to the children of those forefathers. In other words, what the Gemara is picking up is how much time and attention the Torah gives to the story of Eliezer. Because, firstly, the Torah tells us what happened. That Avraham made him take an oath, that he promised him success, that he said the angel would accompany him, or at least as we've learned, the angel would even lead the way in front of him. Then we learn how he goes to Haran, he gets to the place, he makes his deal with Hashem, Rivka appears, she gives the correct answer, she invites him back to meet the family, he tells the whole family the story, right? But then, when Eliezer tells the family the story, instead of the Torah doing what would have been much more efficient and saying, Eliezer told them everything that happened, the Torah tells the whole story again, this time in Eliezer's words.
But
What?
But there were two differences.
Yes, there are differences, right. And we've already noted some of those differences, right? But the question is, why do we have to have all that information twice? So if you look inside the Torah, the amount of space that this story takes up is large. You could fit into the space of the story, you could fit the 10 Commandments 6 or 7 times. That's what the Gemara is saying. Yafa, look, what is more beautiful or precious is the story of the servant, even more than the instructions that the Torah gives us. The most important parts of Judaism are substantially shorter than the story of Eliezer. Now you have to ask yourself, why is that? What does the Gemara mean? Besides the fact that the Torah repeats all this information, which is subject to many different commentaries. But the question is, what does the Gemara mean? What's the Gemara telling us? Now, in the context of what we've been learning, we're going to get a very unique angle on the story, because what we've learned is that Eliezer is the story of Hatzlacha. And we've understood now that Hatzlacha and success are not identical. Because what everybody calls success is the result of a healthy investment or consistency or hard work. Hatzlacha is a gift. Hatzlacha is exactly like Avraham told Eliezer that Hashem's going to send his angel ahead of you. And because of that, everything's going to fall into place. So once we understand what Eliezer's story is about, that helps appreciate why his story is given so much time, so much attention. Or more correctly, why the Gemara calls it Yafa. The Gemara calls it something which is beautiful and something which is special. In fact, in a certain regard, it's even more special than the Torah. So one of the things that we know about Judaism is that free choice is a very big part of being Jewish. So much so that if we did not believe in the principle of free choice, the whole of Judaism could never happen. Because as the Rambam points out, one of our fundamental beliefs is reward and punishment. And you cannot be rewarded for something that you didn't choose to do, in the same way as you cannot suffer the consequence for something that you didn't choose to do. So, very much at the bedrock of the whole experience of Judaism is the principle of free choice. The question is, where do we have free choice? So the Gemara tells us, Hakol bidei shamayim, everything is in the hands of heaven. In other words, everything is orchestrated from on high, chutz miyiras shamayim, except for fear of heaven. In other words, what it's saying is that Hashem could make anything happen, but he cannot make us feel a dedication to him, or follow his mitzvahs, or have a relationship with him. That is free choice. That's up to us. Now, free choice has a tremendous advantage, and it also has a disadvantage. The tremendous advantage of free choice is, if I do something because I chose to do it, then I can get the value of what I've done. I can have a sense of achievement, and as we've just mentioned, could be rewarded for it. Whereas if something is done by Hashem, it doesn't really have that value for me. So for example, if a person is born with a particular talent, that's not a reason for the person to feel that they've achieved anything. That's a gift from Hashem. Hakol bidei shamayim. Now the question is, what's the advantage of things when Hashem does them. So the advantage of things when we do them is ownership, a sense of achievement, that it's meaningful for us. But what's the advantage of things when Hashem does them? Success. Hatzlacha. That's the advantage. So that's what the Gemara is telling us over here. Yafa sichasen shel avtei avos, that it is more beautiful, the conversation of the servants of the forefathers, yosem itarasen shel banim, more than the instruction, and of course the following of those instructions, of the children. In other words, Yafa doesn't mean it's better. Yafa means it's more attractive. It's more exciting. Everybody would love to have a world where everything has hatzlacha, where everything just flies easily. Now there's another layer of messaging in this. The fact that it says that the conversation of the servant of Avram is Yafa, is more beautiful than the Torah of the children of Avram, that's information. Where did we find that information? In the Torah. Yeah. That's where we find it, in the Torah. Because it's the Torah that tells us that he has a story in so much detail. Now, the significance of that is that whatever is in the Torah is part of our lives. The Torah is not just a story of things that happened once upon a time, and then after that, a series of instructions. Every part of the Torah is an instruction. If the Torah felt it was necessary to tell us this story, it's because this story is part of our lives, and it's a lesson for our lives. And then if the Torah chose to include these details in that story, it's because those details are relevant in our lives. And if the Torah gave so much airtime to a story that is about Hatzlacha, meaning where Hashem steps in and makes things happen in a way that is completely beyond us, then the message is that we are empowered to have Hatzlacha, even in our spiritual choices. So in Eliezer's case, because what he's doing is to fulfill Avram's mission, ultimately, if you think about it, what he's doing is the equivalent in his world of us fulfilling Hashem's mission in our world. Eliezer is not Jewish. Eliezer doesn't have to observe mitzvahs. This is his mitzvah. His mitzvah is find a wife for Yitzchak. And what happens is that his mitzvah is given wings, that Hashem turbo boosts his efforts. Of course, he's got to put in his part. And he's got to get on his camel, and he's got to travel to Haran, and he's got to make his deal, and he's got to have the conversation with the family. But the measure of success that he gets for having done all of those things is considerably, in fact, radically more than what he deserves. And that's the message for us. Every single one of us, in our commitment to Hashem, can also have Hatzlacha. Hatzlacha is not an excuse not to work. Hatzlacha is not waiting for Hashem to do everything on our behalf. Hatzlacha is we do our bit, but the results are far, far greater than what we expected. In other words, this parasha is telling us that every one of us is capable of Hatzlacha, not only in the business context, but in the spiritual context as well. Which brings us back to the key question, how do you get Hatzlacha? So now we've been told that Hatzlacha is available, and Hatzlacha is something that could really modify our lives and our world and our spiritual development in an incredible way. Okay, if this is so powerful, how do I do it? So you've got to go back to Eliezer's story. You've got to see, what did Eliezer do that was unique, that was special? He got on his camel. Okay, there was no alternative. You've got to get on your animal. You've got to go travel to the place. That's not something special and unique. Even the fact that he makes a deal with Hashem, I don't know if that's altogether unique. People tend to bargain frequently for things that they wish to have. The fact that he comes up with a test of Rivka's character, it's clever, but it's not something which is out of the ordinary. And of course, the fact that he goes to speak to the family and has to give a very compelling story of why Rivka should come with him, that makes a lot of sense. So what does Eliezer do that's a little bit out of the ordinary or kind of unexpected? We're going to identify two things. And the two things that Eliezer does that are so special are the two clues, or I should say the two methods that we could use in order to have Hatzlacha. The second one is going to be more obvious than the first. So we'll start with the second one. The second one is that, and again, if you look at the language that the Gemara uses when it tells us about this, the Gemara actually alludes to this particular point. Now, the reason it's the second one is not because it happened second, it's because it's not the core of what makes him have Hatzlacha. But we'll start with the second one. See, the Gemara says, Yafa sichason shalavde umois. What is a sicha? In the world of Chabad, a sicha refers to a particular kind of talk that the Rebbe would give in a public forum, a talk, obviously teaching Torah. In colloquial Hebrew, sicha is conversation, which implies that it's actually quite light and, not necessarily something which has a fortune of meaning in it. But we're going to discover what sicha means in this week's parasha. Because when Rivka goes with Eliezer back to Israel, so the Torah tells us that she meets Yitzchak while he is in the middle of something very important. Does anybody know what he was doing at the time that Rivka arrives? He was davening mincha. Right? He was davening mincha. And that's when Rivka arrives, when he's davening mincha. How does the Torah describe mincha, or the fact that he was praying? Vayetze Yitzchak lo suach basade. That Yitzchak went out to converse in the field, except that the conversation is not with another person, it's a conversation with Hashem. So that's where the Gemara tells us that there are multiple names for prayer in Hebrew. There's tefillah, rina, bakasha, sicha. So sicha is a word for prayer. Therefore, when the Gemara tells us yafa sichason shel avdei avos, that the conversation of the slave of our forefather was so beautiful, it's not talking about the conversation that he had with the family, even though that is what takes up a lot of the space in the Torah. But that's not the part that's beautiful. The part that's beautiful is the conversation that he has with Hashem. That he effectively says, the only way this is going to work is if you, Hashem, make it work. So it's not a regular prayer. People often have requests that they put into their prayers. And for many people, that is the sum total of what prayer is. It's please and thank you. So the requests are the please part. And the thank you is the gratitude part. But it's not just that he says, Hashem, please allow this to work. It's more like he's saying, it's in your hands. I actually don't direct how things are going to play out. I'm here, I've arrived at the destination, and I'm about to do what I'm supposed to do. But I ask you, please grant me hatzlacha. That's what he says. If you will grant me hatzlacha, if you will allow this to work. This is not just an ordinary prayer. This is a prayer that acknowledges that it's completely in Hashem's hands. That I am not the one who drives my own success. So, what's the first step that we're aware of? Again, it's the second in terms of intensity or importance, but it's the first that happened. How does a person achieve hatzlacha? First, you have to daven for it. And not daven to say, just in some kind of self-assured way, Hashem, grant me hatzlacha, but to the contrary, it's to say it in a very humble way, to say, I know this cannot work without your bracha, so therefore I'm asking you, please, to give me success. So that's your first consciousness that you have to have of what it means to have hatzlacha, or how a person gets hatzlacha. But before that, there's something even more fundamental that a person has to consider if they want to have hatzlacha. Now, even though in the story, it's something that happens later in the story, so it comes second in the story, but in concept, it belongs first, because it's a much more fundamental concept. Eliezer comes to the family, and needless to say, obviously, he's got to introduce himself. Now, when you go to weddings and the MC gets up and he says, for those of you who don't know me, my name is so-and-so, and I'm the brother of the bride, or whatever the case is. So Eliezer arrives at the family, and he introduces himself, right? I'd like to ask you, how many times in the story, the whole story, from start to finish, is Eliezer's name mentioned? Zero. Throughout the entire story, he's referred to as the servant.
So where do we know his name from?
From last week's parasha. But in this week we don't refer to him by name. We refer to him as the servant. So here he is in front of the family, and he's obviously got to introduce himself. And you look in the parasha, and he says they wanted to eat, and whatever. He says, I'm not eating until I've said my piece. And then he starts, Eved Avraham Anochi. I am Avraham's slave. I think it's important to use that word at this point because the implication of servant sounds a lot more neutral than the implication of slave. There are very specific overtones of a slave. Legally, a slave has zero independence. Now, what that means is, legally, in a Torah framework, if a person has a slave, and a slave is walking in the street, and the slave sees money lying in the street, that clearly somebody has dropped and clearly belongs to nobody. Now, if you or I walk in the street in that situation, we're allowed to take that money. It's completely acceptable. If the slave is in that situation and he picks up the money, as soon as he picks up the money, it is automatically the property of his owner, of his master. Because a slave has no personal identity. He has no independence. So the fact that he says, Eved Avraham Anochi, is a very important positioning statement because what he's really saying is, I'm not here in my personal capacity. I'm not doing any of this. I'm just a vehicle. I'm just a representative. This is Avraham's mission. And the reason that this mission is so successful is because of the greatness of Avraham, not because of me. I haven't done anything. He told me to go, I went. He promised me an angel, I got an angel. It's got nothing to do with me. In other words, what he's saying, and this is why it's so fundamental, what he's saying is, my success is not for my purpose. My success is for the purpose of the mission. There's something bigger than me happening over here. This is going to be the first formal shidduch in history. This is, after all the years and decades of investment that Avram has made into teaching the world about God, this is going to ensure that it continues. Because now his son will have a wife, which means that they will have a family, which means that there's going to be a Jewish people at some point in time. This is mission critical, not just for me, because I have to go back and I have to show face, but this is critical for the whole of the future of the Jewish nation, the whole of the future of Hashem's purpose for creation. This is not about me. Eved Avraham Anochi. I stand here as the slave of Avraham. You know, have you ever had this kind of conversation, possibly with your child or maybe your business partner, where you know that a thing's going to work in a certain way and they insist on doing it differently, right? So what do you say? You get very frustrated at some point. So you say, you know what? Do it your way. And if it's your child, very often you add after that, and don't come crying to me afterwards. Hashem has a similar approach to us. Hashem says, look, you get to choose. If you feel that you can do this, go ahead and do it. And the extent of your success will obviously be relative to your abilities. So if you're biting off more than you can chew, there's nothing I can do about that. You've decided that you want to be, you're very confident, and you want to be in charge of this process, so you go ahead and you be in charge of this process. But if you're willing to humble yourself enough and say, it's not about me. The reason I'm doing this is because there's a bigger mission, which is how a Jewish person is supposed to live their life. It's not supposed to be that I need to have a successful business so that I go down as one of the great entrepreneurs or one of the great corporate doyens of history. A Jewish person is supposed to say, I am the servant of Avraham, which means if I'm going to make a successful business, that is because Hashem has endowed me with the abilities to succeed in business, and therefore I can use the proceeds of that success in order to have a positive impact on the world. So I could give tzedakah, I could employ people who otherwise wouldn't have employment, I could use my clout to have positive influence over people. For example, if you want to be in this work environment, you have to follow a certain moral code, or you have to study certain things. You know, I could leverage that position to further Hashem's mission in this world. There are two totally different approaches to what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And that's an example in business. The truth is, the example could play out in any arena. Why do I want my children to grow up as decent people? Is it about me, because I don't want anybody to look at me and say I was a rotten parent? Or is it because there's a mission beyond me, which is, in the same way as Hashem says he loves Avraham because he passed on the teachings to his children, I have a responsibility to teach my children equally. And so it goes in every single sphere of life. Why do I have to exercise? Is it because I want to have a particular look? So everybody says, oh, look at you, you know, you're so fit, you're so this. Or is it because the Rambam tells us that Heyois Haguf Bari B'Chazak Midarkei Hashem, that to have a healthy body is part of how you serve Hashem? Different perspective. That's what Eliezer is teaching us. The minute a person adopts for real the perspective that Eved Avraham Anoichi, I'm not living life in my personal capacity, I'm living here in order to achieve things that are of value to Hashem, then Hashem can give me Hatzlacha. Because now I've stepped out of the driver's seat and I said, I'm here to achieve what you want. So Hashem says, in that case, we can work together. And in that case, I can accelerate your success to levels way beyond what you would have expected. And that gives us a really practical take-home message that the two most significant things that a person needs to do on a regular basis is remind themselves that life is not self-serving, or at least it shouldn't be, that life should be about a broader perspective, that I'm here to fulfill. I've been gifted a life, I've been gifted opportunities, and I've been gifted talents. And so my responsibility is to use all of that to achieve what Hashem wants. And then I'm on Hashem's bandwagon, which obviously travels at higher speeds than mine does. And equally, I have to constantly daven. Every single day. Not just to daven in the generic sense, but to daven in a specific sense. Please, like Eliezer said, Hashem, let my path be matzliach. Let it have this unique bracha of hatzlacha. And so when a person approaches life with that kind of dedication and humility, then they have hatzlacha in their lives.